Welcome to Shepherd Data's Shepherd Speaks webinar. We're thrilled to have Joshua Gilliland as our guest speaker today. Josh is a California attorney and an associate at Grinnan, Peffer, Salander, and Lawley. He is the co-creator of the Legal Geeks blog and podcast, which has made the ABA Journal as one of the top 100 blogs for lawyers from 2013 to 18, and was nominated for Best Podcast for the 2015 Geeky Awards. He grew up in Silicon Valley and is a graduate of UC Davis with a degree in political science and earned his law degree from McGeorge School of Law, University of the Pacific. Josh is a lifelong geek who has presented at nerd nights across California, San Diego Comic-Con, San Diego Comic Fest, and has presented at over 500 attorney seminars and trade shows in the United States and Canada. Josh will be presenting The Curse of the Haunted Law Library. We have applied for CLA credit and will send out this information to all attendees once approved. If you have any questions for Josh, please use the chat box at any time, and we'll save some time at the end to answer the questions. Please also use the chat box if you have experienced any technical difficulties. We hope you enjoy this fun and informative Halloween-themed webinar. Josh?
Thank you. I want to say it's great to be with my friends at Shepherd Data again. I have loved visiting them in Minneapolis for e-discovery CLE events, and it was a treat to be asked to do a Halloween show where we can actually talk about the legal issues with some wonderful pop culture references. You know, when you think of what we do in e-discovery, there are no found footage document review horror stories. There are no e-discovery scream queens doing first pass review. But what we do have is a sense of humor and a love of the law. And with that, let's jump into The Curse of the Haunted Law Library. We're going to hit a lot of classic film and TV shows. We'll explore Psycho. We'll talk about the 1959 classic House on Haunted Hill, Kolchak the Night Stalker from 1974, Hammer Horrors, The Horror of Dracula with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, Brides of Dracula without Christopher Lee, but Peter Cushing is there. And we will end with Young Frankenstein, which might be the best Halloween movie of all time. So let's explore what we have for our content today. So, Psycho. Everyone is familiar with the shower scene, but what people often forget is, how did we get to the Bates Motel to begin with? And that starts with the film beginning in Phoenix, Arizona. And it's pretty surreal when you get down to seeing date and time of where everything's happening. And Marion Crane works for a real estate firm. And it begins with having a midday affair with a lover, goes back to work, and somebody comes into the office with her boss, and he's buying a new home outside of Phoenix in cash as a wedding present for his daughter. And he's very flamboyant in throwing around the money with, here's $40,000, and shows it directly to Marion Crane, kind of flaunting it at her. $40,000 is a little over $370,000 today, which really wouldn't be enough to get a house in definitely the Bay Area, Phoenix, hit and miss. But she's given the cash by her boss, and she's supposed to go deposit it. And it's a Friday afternoon. Instead, she goes back home, packs a bag, and decides to skip town. And we never learn why she's skipping town. But she goes driving from Phoenix, ends up in Bakersfield after a police stop, and she decides to buy a new car on the spot with trading in her current vehicle with a police officer in tow. So she buys this car for $700 cash and trades in her old vehicle. which is roughly over $6,500 today, nearly $6,600 in money today, cash. That should raise red flags to a whole lot of people for someone to just go to a used car lot, buy a car without test driving it, without asking any questions, and then driving off, leaving a police officer at the used car lot. Those are all giant legal issues because the hero of the story is not a good person. When you look at what she did, it's full on embezzlement, which is the fraudulent appropriation of property by a person to whom it has been entrusted. Well, her boss entrusted her with $40,000 cash that she was supposed to take to the bank. She doesn't do that. She skips town. It's also theft outright, with being able to go, I'm taking this money that belongs to somebody else, that belongs to her employer, that's supposed to pay for a new home that somebody's buying, and it falls under both. So the criminal charges that she could be hit with out of the gate are embezzlement and theft. That's the heroine of the story, and she is killed in the middle of the story. Just from a filmmaking perspective, that had never happened before. It was a massive shock moment for the audience, not just because of the brutal murder that takes place, but because who's the lead character now? Again, brilliant storytelling, but this is a legal podcast and webinar, which raises the guy who killed her, Norman Bates, who has the Bates Motel. And we find out that Norman had a very dominating mother. And Marion Crane can hear Norman and mother arguing up at the main house by the hotel that they run. And she thinks, God, that woman is really mean to her son. And we get creepy statements by Norman when he makes sandwiches for Marion that include a boy's best friend is his mother, which again, red flag for any male over 8 saying that. Super, super creepy and uncomfortable. But we find out at the end that mom's been dead for years, which means Norman acts like his mom to the point of having arguments with his mother. So when he's arrested for double homicide, which includes killing Marion and a private eye and dumping their bodies in a bog, is he insane? And in California, our rule on the insanity test is written kind of odd. So, the normal test is, does the person understand the wrongfulness of their actions? And the way that we state it in California is in a criminal proceeding, when someone's arguing that they are not guilty by reason of insanity, that defense shall not be found by the trier of fact solely on the basis of a personality or adjustment disorder or seizure disorder or an addiction to or abuse from intoxicating substances. And the case law that follows this is pretty intense because it's all over the map with, you can't say, I got drunk, therefore the insanity defense applies to me. And the fact that we actually wrote that down means that it had to have happened at some point in time, because we don't enact laws proactively. Now, the film concludes with a psychologist at the police station explaining to a room full of people about Bates's mental diagnosis. And let's just take a look at how he's described, because we need to understand that diagnosis if we're going to find out if the insanity defense applies to Norman Bates or not. And we have the inspector say, in Norman's case, he was simply doing everything possible to keep alive the illusion of his mother being alive. And whenever reality came too close, when danger or desire threatened that illusion, he'd dress up even to a cheap wig he bought, and he'd walk in the house, sit in her chair, speak in her voice. He tried to be his mother, and it gets creepier. That's what I meant when I said I got the story from the mother. She thinks Norman has been taken away because of his crimes. She insists she did nothing, that Norman committed all the murders just to keep her from being discovered. She even smiled a bit as she said that. Of course, she feels badly about it, but also somewhat relieved to be, as she put it, free of Norman at last. When the mind houses two personalities, there's always a battle. In Norman's case, the battle is over. The dominant personality has won. So what's the verdict here? Did Norman Bates understand the wrongfulness of his actions when he killed two different people and then disposed of their bodies? Now, I think he is guilty, and I don't think the insanity defense absolves him of those murders. And the reason for that is Mother knew she was killing people. And then when Norman took back over, he saw Marion Crane's butchered body and decided to cover up the crime. And we get full-on Dexter style cleaning up the murder scene. This is where it's invented, where you see Norman wrapping up the body, cleaning the bathroom. He goes out of his way to make sure that the crime scene is cleansed. He then puts her into the trunk of the car and pushes the car into the bog. Similar with the private eye who actually enters the house. So there's a trespass with him, but that doesn't give Norman the right to commit murder. There is one of the big insanity defenses in our country's history happened with the assassination of President James Garfield. And the guy who killed the president was nuts. His name was Gutierrez, and he had all these wild delusions of grandeur. But when he saw the president and the Secretary of State walking to the train station before the 4th of July, he went up, hesitated, and then shot the president. And Garfield took 3 months to die. It was a horrible situation for the country. When we tried Gutierrez, the jury quickly thought, this guy's nuts, but he still knows right from wrong because he hesitated. And they found him guilty, and he was hung in short order. I think it's similar with Bates because of the fact that Norman cleaned up Marion Crane's body and then disposed of the private eye's body. Those are separate crimes that shows he knows what he was doing was wrong. If you want to take the position that he didn't know what he was doing when he was mother, he still understood the wrongfulness of his actions in disposing the bodies, making him an accessory to murder. So I do believe that he could be convicted of murder despite not being of sound mind, but he still understood the wrongfulness of his actions. Let's go up to 1959 with our only Vincent Price movie. And I have to say, Vincent Price was rightfully cool. Now, this film has a very 1959 feel to it. We have an eccentric millionaire named Frederick Lauren, who's played by Vincent Price, who's on his third wife, and he keeps referring to her as, she is so amusing. Well, they come up with this plan that they're going to rent a haunted house that supposedly has 7 ghosts in it. They then invite 5 random people that apparently he researches and goes that one, and that one. And with a contractual offer that if you spend the night in this haunted house and you survive, you will each get $10,000. Clearly, no lawyers were involved in advising this millionaire, who in today's world would be an eccentric billionaire. Pick a 1%er who's gone up to space in his own rocket ship, and imagine one of them doing something this crazy. No one in their right mind who's an attorney would let a client do this. So the premise is someone could die, and we're going to do this anyway, and the survivors each get $10,000. There's no waivers signed here. And they're going into a place that arguably is dangerous, and as we see, they make it more dangerous. So out of the gate, we have fun with premises liability, which in California is everyone is responsible not only for the result of his or her willful acts, but also for any injury occasioned to another by his or her want of ordinary care or skill in the management of his or her property or person. So they go to this mansion. People have already died there. It's in somewhat disrepair with massive cobwebs. And they're told, hey, if you live, you get money. Well, let's talk about the fact that this is a contractual relationship means that everyone who's attending this is a business visitor, which means they are individuals invited or permitted to enter or remain on land in the possession of another for the purpose directly or indirectly connected with business dealings between them. They're there for the money, meaning it's a contractual relationship that if they survive, they get 10 grand. There's a lot of creepy things going on. So here's what you should not do if you're hosting a Halloween party. Do not lock everybody in and cut the phone lines, create a heightened stressful situation, and then give everyone loaded guns, which begs the question, if you think you're in a haunted house, why give the living people weapons to shoot each other? And then the big one, there's an open pool of acid without guardrails in the basement that eats all flesh and leaves only bone. This is just grossly irresponsible. If there's a fire, no one can get out. They're all going to die. No one can call for help if there's a medical emergency. The fact that everyone is now armed is just a formula for disaster for people getting killed. Now, the premises for why we are here is the fact that the husband and wife really need a divorce. And this is still 1959. No-fault divorce did not happen in California until 1969. So you would need cause for a divorce, which means like somebody cheated. Well, one form of marital strife that would be grounds for divorce is trying to kill your spouse. And they have a heated conversation with the wife, apparently tried to kill her husband earlier and failed, but there's a debate about whether or not there's any evidence. Instead of saying like, hey, we have irreconcilable differences, or the fact she's crazy and she tried to murder me, that's what you hire lawyers and private eyes for, and then go to the police and say, she tried to kill me, let's get out of this marriage, as opposed to, we're going to have a heightenedly dangerous situation that can result in people dying because we need our marriage to end. That's the premise of the movie, which is why it's wildly 1959. And there's a body count with it because they're trying to manipulate people into killing specific individuals. There's a lot going on with this, but that millionaire would be on the hook for a lot of liability and inviting people to a very unsafe place for a business arrangement. Let's jump up to October 1974. And we have Kolchak the Night Stalker, which is with Darren McGavin. I'm pleased to say this premiered 4 days before I was born. So I don't know if that's why I have a strong affinity for it, but it's a wonderful series. And it was X-Files way before the X-Files. And the 5th episode, The Werewolf, was filmed on the Queen Mary, which is still in Long Beach, California. And it's been a hotel and it's used for conferences. And even the California bars had events there. And yeah, there's a lot of paranormal stories about it as well. But when you look at this episode, you can see the things that are still on the Queen Mary tour today. Well, the ship is given a fictitious name, and this is like a holiday cruise right after Christmas, and Kolchak is sent out to do a story about this cruise ship's final voyage. But there's one problem. There's a werewolf on board. And this episode is a very different werewolf story because there aren't any that I know of with a werewolf on a cruise ship, meaning that you're stuck in a confined space. So cruise ships have problems with everyone catching horrible diseases and ending up in quarantine, not quite so much with a werewolf. So this raises the issue for a cruise line. What's a cruise ship's liability for passenger safety if there's a werewolf on board? And it allows us to look at common carriers, which is a very old term going back to the Crown about ships or trains, and it's been extended to airplanes, that if somebody's traveling from point A to point B, they're entrusted with your safety. You're not in control because you're on a boat or a giant ship or an airplane. So the test that we have to look at is a common carrier owes to its passengers the highest degree of care in the anticipation and prevention of violence from its employees, other passengers, and even strangers. And the issue is the harm foreseeable? Well, is a werewolf on a cruise ship a foreseeable harm? I'm going to go with no, but there are known threats that are foreseeable for a cruise ship to have liability. Drunken passengers. The cruise ship can be liable for someone who gets drunk and starts fights. Or if they're transporting wild animals and the wild animal gets out of its cage and goes on a rampage, there can be liability there. If there's negligence that's happened for the injuries caused by the animal getting out. Think of a werewolf as both the drunken passenger and the escaped animal, because it goes around killing passengers and crew in brutal ways. The cruise ship does respond to the situation, so they do try to meet their duty, but it's a very joyful episode, and you can see these on the NBC app if you do want to go revisit this treasure trove of horror stories from 1974. Which brings us to our first Hammer horror movie, and that's The Horror of Dracula. In my opinion, Christopher Lee is the best Dracula because he was tall, super scary, killed people in World War II, and leaned in and had a rip-roaring good time with the role. So in this film, it's very much a spin on Bram Stoker's Dracula, that we have Jonathan Harker, who is an attorney who decides to go out and try to find Dracula and dispose of the vampire. Unfortunately for Harker, things go badly and he ends up becoming a vampire himself. So what happens? Well, his buddy Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing, goes searching for his buddy, finds him, and then says, ooh, I'm going to have to put down my friend because he's now a vampire. So this raises the issue. Is it justified homicide to kill a sleeping vampire? Which, to be fair, is the best time to kill a sleeping vampire is when the vampire is asleep. Because if not, they're super strong, fast, and generally win most fisticuffs. So Self-defense and defense of others requires that someone must actually and reasonably believe in the necessity of defending oneself from imminent danger of death or great bodily harm. So, was Van Helsing right to kill his friend Jonathan Harker, now a vampire, while the vampire slumbered? So, did Van Helsing believe that he needed to defend himself or others against an imminent threat to protect his or her life from these sleeping vampires? There's a concept in the law with self-defense that you can have an imperfect self-defense, that if your belief in the danger is unreasonable, that you can still argue self-defense, but it's now imperfect because you're not necessarily dealing with an imminent threat. I think this would turn on the fact on whether we view a vampire as a human being, as opposed to a former human being. In this case, Van Helsing could argue that at nightfall, the two vampires in this crypt would get up and start killing people to feed. I did what I had to do to make sure the community stayed safe and were not murdered. Good argument. But I think it would fail if we view the vampires as human. However, if we view them as not human, and this is more like exterminating rats or rattlesnakes that are in your basement, going after them when they're asleep is fair game because you're not dealing with a human being. So self-defense would be tricky, but if you take the position that they're not human anymore, you get around the self-defense issue of killing somebody while they're asleep. And that's a rough one, but I think it's the right decision because you don't want vampires running around murdering people in these classic horror films. Next up after Horror of Dracula is Brides of Dracula, which does not star anyone playing Dracula. So the original working title of this film was Disciples of Dracula, which would have made more sense because there's no Dracula in this movie. And it begins with the narration that Dracula is dead. However, there's a baroness who lives in a castle. And turns out her son is a vampire. And she keeps her son chained in a nice room with an ankle bracelet that I think that's silver and thus he can't escape it. And he's can't leave the room. And the Baroness and her assistant are luring in women to feed the vampire. So there's a lot wrong with that. Out of the gate, she does not get the Mom of the Year award because they're in a conspiracy to commit murder. If your plan is we lure young women back to the mansion, feed them, let them sleep, and then we let my son kill them and drink their blood, that's just not okay. Like there is no way that that is in any way legal because it's a conspiracy to commit murder. So two crimes. You have the conspiracy, the agreement to do an illegal act, and then the actual illegal act, which is letting women get killed by a vampire. And the son has converted several women to vampires, and they're referred to as his brides. Does this mean that vampires are bigamists? Well, bigamy is the act of marrying one person while still legally married to another, and you're only allowed to be married to one person at a time. So for the vampires, there's no marriage ceremony. It's a bite on the neck, and he's recruiting a team of vampires at that point by building the team. Not okay. They, at best, would be poly, which is not a crime and something that a lot of you see in different communities across the country because, again, it's the world we live in. So let's talk about one of the best love letters to universal horror and just monster movies and pure comic genius. And that's Young Frankenstein, where they do the horror seriously and they do the comedy with brilliance. So the beginning of the film, we have a corpse in a coffin, and that coffin is opened, and we see that the corpse is holding on to a little box that apparently has his will and instructions in it. And that box has to be separated from the corpse. Does that mean that we have disturbing a corpse in order to execute a will? So we have lots of laws when it comes to dead bodies. And ironically, I've done lots of blog posts about the treatment of dead bodies, which was not something I would ever expected to do in my legal career. I'm normally the e-discovery guy, but we have a lot of law with dead people. So, family of the deceased has a legally recognized right to entomb the remains of the deceased family members with integrity and without mutilation. Next of kin can have a claim against anyone who disturbs that body. Finally, the deceased has a right to bury a body and an actionable wrong if the body is disturbed. The recognized basis of damages is emotional distress, and courts have held that a direct blood descendant has standing to sue for desecration of the corpse. And this varies state from state, meaning that it's been problems in different places, which is, again, disturbing on multiple levels. But when you think about the law of wills, the goal is to follow the deceased's wishes to make sure that those are properly executed, which means, yeah, they're taking a box from a body that was holding it in its coffin. That does meet the definition of disturbing a corpse, but it's done in order to execute the will. I think it was done correctly, but it is super weird. And so you have two competing legal issues at the same time with keeping bodies intact and not disturbing them because we want bodies buried. It's for keeping the living to feel safe and secure and not have disease spread. First, executing a will. Next up, grave robbing. Because if you're going to reanimate a corpse and bring it to life, you need a corpse. And after someone had been executed, we have our Dr. Frankenstein and Igor go out and dig up a body that's just been executed so they can use it in their experiment. Well, we have grave robbing laws that have been on the books since the 19th century. This happened a lot in England, where you had a black market of people digging up bodies and selling them to medical schools. So that way medical students had cadavers to work on. There was legislation about this. There were lots of criminal cases about this because you basically had this weird black market corpse business of stealing the remains of people who were buried and then selling them to medical schools. And it really upset the next of kin to find out that Gramps was dug up and sold to a medical school to be experimented on for people to learn. On the counter argument here is doctors can't learn how the human body works without having cadavers to practice on, which is why legislation was eventually enacted that allowed for people to donate their corpses to science. That's not happening here. In this film, we have full-on grave robbing with digging up a corpse and then taking it back to the castle for examination and reanimation. Which brings us to the question, is reanimating a corpse desecration of a corpse? And one way to look at this is only if you fail. So desecration of a corpse is the unlawfully disturbing or removing human remains. And it can be unlawfully damaging or destroying human remains. And then the super creepy part with sex, which that's just not an issue here, thank God. So if you move human remains, you could be committing desecration of a corpse. And there have been lots of cases with that. We don't have issues with reanimation because that's the stuff of science fiction and monster movies. And arguably, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is the first science fiction horror story ever told. So they absolutely are questionably committing desecration of a corpse if this didn't work. Bringing a corpse to life, it's no longer a corpse, meaning we're now in a different world because this just doesn't happen. The law is not designed for people to come back from the dead. Now we have the wonderful Gene Hackman scene playing Friar Harold, who this is a spin on Bride of Frankenstein, and it's truly glorious and hysterical. So was Friar Harold's duty to the creature as an invitee like violated? Well, Friar Harold's blind, but he still inadvertently pours soup in the creature's lap, and while trying to light a cigar, inadvertently lights the creature's thumb on fire. You shouldn't do that to guests. So, were the injuries inflicted upon the creature from a lack of ordinary care? Now, could Friar Harold have shown greater management of pouring soup or lighting the cigar to have avoided injuries? He could have, but then we wouldn't have the great vaudeville comedy scenes. So if you have someone without eyesight trying to pour soup, people who are blind successfully do that all the time. Same with not lighting somebody's thumb on fire. There are ways to do that by touch, so you don't light somebody's thumb on fire instead. So I do think Friar Harold has some problems. You should contact his homeowner's insurance because there could be some claims coming their way that need to be they need to provide a defense to. But then we wouldn't have one of the most iconic comedy scenes in movie history without that. So with that concludes our Halloween material. I do want to thank our good friends at Shepherd and everyone here who's taken the time to join us. And if you want to follow me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, here's our information. You can also find our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. And I would love to answer questions about horror topics and the law.
Thanks, Josh. I do have a couple of questions. The first one is going back to Psycho.
Okay.
What change of facts would you believe would have validated Bates's insanity defense?
That he has to show that he didn't know the wrongfulness of his acts. And I think the issue is his covering up and disposing of the body, both bodies. I think that's what crosses the line here. If that had not happened, if he had just, awoken to find a corpse and then didn't take an affirmative act to cover up the crime, I think that would have helped us out of this situation. But the covering up the crime shows knowledge of the wrongfulness of a separate crime. So even if we want to say that there's a mental wall between the two personalities, he still understood what he was doing was wrong and covering up the murders. So we would need to get around that and showing that, if Mother had taken care of everything, and then he found out, what do you mean? Where'd Marion go? I thought she was leaving early this morning. That would be a very different situation. But the fact that he took part in the cover-up is evidence of guilt, in my view.
Okay, so for this weekend is Halloween. What movie should I watch?
So one that I think back to when I was in college, and the Halloween that at UC Davis, in my first apartment, I had cable set up the day of Halloween. And the first movie that came on was Brendan Fraser's The Mummy, which was from 1999. And I thought, that's fun. So that's a guilty pleasure that I do enjoy. I would also be very remiss if I did not encourage my brother's horror comedy that he made 10 years ago called The Selling, about a real estate agent knowingly trying to sell a haunted house. It's like Ghosted Mr. Chicken type level of comedy horror. That's fun, and I enjoy watching that because my brother made it, which is on Amazon Video.
Great. And then another question is, do you have any suggestions for upcoming events for CLE or other things of interest that I might wish to participate in?
So I'm not doing any other CLEs yet. I've seen a lot of good notices coming out from folks that look very interesting. The California Bar has some good ones. And I also, despite a lifetime in e-discovery, I do like general law a lot about seeing that. As for this weekend, like we have 2 live events that we haven't had since the pandemic. So this weekend, I'm going to Denver Fan Expo, where we're going to have 3 panels. And the Colorado Attorney General is going to be joining us to speak on 2 of them. And I'm really excited about that because he's a nice guy and he's the state Attorney General. Over Thanksgiving weekend, we'll be at San Diego Comic-Con Special Edition, where we'll have 2 panels that I can't announce yet, other than we'll be there and it's going to be lots of fun.
Okay, great. And I think that covers everything we've got.
Fantastic. Again, this has been a joy. And I really appreciate being able to share my morning with you folks before I go back to prepping for a mediation tomorrow. So thank you all.
And thank you, Josh. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Take care now. Thank you.